My mom always said my dad died in an accident, but when I found an old newspaper clipping, I uncovered a secret she never wanted me to know. Story 1. The secret truth about my father. I grew up thinking my dad was a hero. My mom would always talk about him fondly, how he worked hard, how much he loved me, and how he tragically died in a car accident when I was just a baby. For years that was all I knew. But everything changed when I was cleaning out the attic one summer. I found an old cardboard box tucked under a pile of blankets. Inside were photos of my dad, some letters, and an envelope marked for when she's older. Curious, I opened it. It was a yellowed newspaper clipping with a headline that made my heart drop. Local man found dead after violent dispute. I didn't understand. This wasn't the story my mom had told me. I read the article and what I learned shook me to my core. My dad had been killed, not in a car accident, but during a fight at a bar. Witnesses said he was defending a young woman from her abusive boyfriend, but the boyfriend stabbed him in the chaos. When I confronted my mom, she broke down in tears. She admitted she'd lied to protect me. "I didn't want you to grow up thinking the world was so cruel," she said. "I just wanted you to remember your dad as the good man he was." And she was right, my dad was a hero. But now, every time I think of him, I also think of the secret my mom carried for so many years and the weight of the truth she was too afraid to share. Story 2. Granny's dark childhood. I always knew my grandmother was strong, but I never realized she survived something that could have broken anyone else. My grandmother has always been the rock of our family. She's the type of person who could handle anything, calm, collected, and wise beyond her years. But one day during a quiet moment on the porch, she told me a story that changed the way I saw her forever. She grew up in the 1940s in a tiny, poverty-stricken village. Her mother died when she was only 5, and her father remarried quickly to a woman who had no interest in raising someone else's child. The new stepmother made my grandmother's life a living nightmare. When my granny misbehaved, or sometimes even when she didn't, the stepmother would lock her in the cellar for hours. My granny described it in detail: the damp smell, the rats that scurried in the corners, the darkness so thick she couldn't even see her own hands. And this wasn't a one-time punishment, it happened over and over for years. One night it got so bad that she tried to run away. But when her stepmother caught her sneaking out, she dragged her back inside by her hair and didn't let her out of the cellar for 2 whole days. "Why didn't you fight back?" I asked her. She smiled, that calm, wise smile I'd always known. "I did. I fought back every day by staying alive, by refusing to let her break me." Eventually, at the age of 16, my granny left home for good. She worked as a maid, saved every penny, and built the life she wanted. She never looked back. Hearing her story made me realize just how strong she truly is. It's one thing to survive hardship, but it's another to rise above it and create a life filled with love and kindness. My granny isn't just strong, she's a warrior. Story 3. The hang glider incident. My grandpa always seemed like a quiet man, but the day he confessed to causing an accidental death, I realized there was a lot I didn't know about him. My grandpa was the type of person who blended into the background. He liked to sit quietly in his favorite chair, puffing on a pipe, listening to the conversations around him without saying much. But one summer evening during a family barbecue, something changed. He was staring off into the distance when my cousin joked, "What are you thinking about, Grandpa? Your glory days?" To everyone's surprise, he nodded and said, "Yeah, but I don't think you'd call this one a glory moment." We all leaned in. Grandpa didn't talk about his past much, so hearing him open up was a rare event. He told us about a time when he was in his early 20s. He and his friends were at a summer festival where someone was showing off a homemade hang glider. It was a rickety contraption made of wood and fabric, but it looked thrilling. The owner of the glider was charging people a small fee to try it out, and my grandpa couldn't resist. "I didn't think much of it at the time," he said, "but the guy running it didn't seem to know what he was doing. He was just some amateur looking to make a quick buck." Grandpa went up in the glider and, miraculously, survived the ride. But when the next person, a man about his age, tried it, something went horribly wrong. The glider's frame snapped mid-air, sending the man plummeting into a rocky ravine. Grandpa and his friends rushed to help, but it was too late. The man didn't make it. "It wasn't my fault," Grandpa said quietly, "but I can't help feeling like if I'd spoken up, maybe he wouldn't have gone up there." We sat in stunned silence as he finished the story. It was hard to reconcile the quiet, gentle man we knew with someone who had carried such a heavy burden for so many years. That night, I realized something important. Everyone, even the people you think you know best, has a story they've never told. Story 4. My great-grandma's hidden children. She always seemed like the perfect matriarch, But when we discovered my great-grandma's hidden children, we realized she had a secret life no one could have imagined. My great-grandma Ida was the epitome of a sweet old lady. She baked cookies, crocheted blankets, and had a smile that could light up a room. But when she passed away, we uncovered something that turned our family's understanding of her upside down. While going through her belongings, my aunt found a stack of letters tied together with a ribbon. The letters weren't addressed to anyone we recognized. They were from children, grown adults now, who called her Mama. We were confused. My great-grandma had only ever talked about raising 2 children, my grandma and her younger brother. But these letters were from 3 other people. The letters painted a vivid picture. During the Great Depression, Ida had fallen on hard times. She had 3 children from a previous marriage, but when her husband abandoned her, she couldn't afford to take care of them. Reluctantly, she gave them up for adoption, hoping they would find better lives. Years later, after she remarried and had my grandma and great-uncle, she secretly reconnected with her first set of children. She wrote them letters for decades, sending them birthday cards and updates about her life, but she never told her second family about them. When my aunt showed the letters to the rest of us, it sparked a mix of emotions. Some were angry that she kept such a big secret. Others felt deep sympathy for the difficult choices she had to make. For me, it just made her seem even more human. She wasn't just the sweet old lady who made cookies. She was someone who carried the weight of loss and sacrifice for her entire life. Story 5. The Treehouse Tragedy. What started as a childhood adventure in a treehouse ended in heartbreak. My aunt's story is one that I'll never forget. When my aunt was a little girl, she and her best friend, Josie, loved spending their afternoons in the old oak tree behind Josie's house. They built a treehouse together, hammering planks of wood into the branches and calling it their secret hideout. One summer day, the girls overheard Josie's parents arguing. They didn't understand everything, but they knew Josie's father was leaving. That night, Josie came to my aunt in tears. "He's taking me with him," she said. "I don't want to go." The next morning, Josie had a plan. She told my aunt they would run away together and hide in the treehouse until her father left without her. At first, it seemed like a great idea. They packed snacks, a flashlight, and a few blankets. They climbed up into the treehouse and swore they wouldn't come down no matter what. But hours turned into days and the food ran out. Josie got sick from the cold and lack of water. My aunt begged her to climb down and go home, but Josie refused. She was terrified her father would find her. When Josie finally collapsed, too weak to move, my aunt panicked and ran to get help. By the time she brought Josie's mom to the treehouse, it was too late. Josie had passed away. Even now, decades later, my aunt can't talk about that summer without tearing up. It's a story of heartbreak, innocence, and the weight of choices that no child should have to carry. Story 6. The Secret Box in the Attic. The strange box my dad kept hidden in the attic held a story of betrayal, survival, and a family secret no one saw coming. My dad always had a knack for keeping things private. He wasn't a man of many words, and there was an unspoken rule in our house: never ask about his past. But as a kid, my curiosity didn't know boundaries. One rainy afternoon, while exploring the attic, I stumbled upon an old wooden box tucked behind a stack of dusty photo albums. The box was locked, but the way it was hidden made it all the more intriguing. When I asked my dad about it that night, he froze. His normally calm demeanor shifted to something darker. "That box isn't for you," he said sternly. "Leave it alone." But you know how kids are. The more I was told not to do something, the more I wanted to. So, one weekend when my dad was out of town, I went back to the attic with a paperclip in hand, determined to pick the lock. When I finally pried it open, I expected to find old letters or maybe some coins. Instead, there were black and white photos, crumpled documents, and a faded journal. What caught my attention first was a photograph of a woman who looked strikingly familiar. She had my dad's eyes, his sharp cheekbones. She wasn't my grandmother. The journal belonged to her. Her name was Clara, and based on the entries, she and my dad had lived in a small European village during the war. The entries started sweetly enough. Clara talked about her love for her son, their simple life, and her hope for the future. But then as I read further, the tone shifted. She described a betrayal. One of her neighbors had reported her to the authorities. She didn't say why, only that she was forced to flee with her son in the dead of night. There were mentions of hiding in barns, crossing rivers, and starving for days on end. Eventually, she wrote about being separated from my dad, who was only 6 years old at the time. She begged for forgiveness, though it wasn't clear why. The journal ended abruptly. At the bottom of the box was a letter, written in shaky handwriting. It was addressed to my dad, but it was never sent. In the letter, Clara explained that she had made a deal to keep him alive, a deal that meant giving herself up. When my dad came home that evening, I couldn't hold back. I brought the box downstairs and demanded answers. He looked at it, then at me, and for the first time in my life I saw tears in his eyes. "She was my mother," he said quietly. "She saved me, but I couldn't save her." As the story unraveled, I learned that after Clara was taken, my dad was placed in an orphanage and later adopted by the family I'd always thought of as his parents. He'd spent his whole life burying the pain of losing Clara, but he couldn't bring himself to get rid of the box. That night we sat together and went through everything in it. For the first time he opened up about his childhood, about the struggles and sacrifices that shaped him. The box wasn't just a relic of his past, it was a testament to his mother's love and resilience. It's strange how much you can learn about someone you thought you knew so well. That box changed the way I saw my dad, not just as a parent but as a person. And Clara? She became a part of our family's story again, no longer hidden away in the attic. Story 7. The letter that changed our family forever. A mysterious letter arrived at our door, unraveling a 70-year-old family secret that changed everything we thought we knew about our past. It was a quiet Sunday morning, the kind where the smell of coffee fills the house, and the only sounds are the birds chirping outside. I remember sitting at the kitchen table, flipping through a newspaper when the doorbell rang. It was strange. Nobody ever visited us that early, especially not without calling. When I opened the door, there was no one there. All I found was an envelope sitting neatly on the doormat. It was old and yellowed, with faded handwriting on the front that simply read, "For the Patterson family." I took it inside, curious and a little uneasy. My mom and dad were in the living room, and when I showed them the envelope, their faces paled. My dad reached out for it with shaking hands, but he didn't open it. Instead, he just stared at it like it was a ghost from his past. Finally, my mom said, "Go on, open it." Inside was a single piece of paper, handwritten, dated June 18, 1955. It began, "To the family who raised my daughter." The words hit my dad like a punch to the gut. He dropped the letter and walked out of the room, leaving my mom and me to pick up the pieces, both literally and emotionally. I started reading. The letter was from a woman named Eleanor who claimed to be my grandmother. But the thing was, my dad's mother, my grandmother, was someone I'd known my whole life. Her name wasn't Eleanor, it was Ruth. Eleanor's letter explained that she had given birth to a baby girl in 1955, but because she was young and unmarried, her parents forced her to give the baby up for adoption. That baby, she wrote, was my dad's mother. Eleanor had been searching for her daughter for decades and had finally found out what had happened to her. But the letter revealed something even more shocking. According to Eleanor, my dad's mother had never been legally adopted. She had been sold. Eleanor's parents had arranged for Ruth to be taken by a wealthy family in exchange for money. There were no legal documents, no records, just a handshake deal and a promise that Eleanor would never come looking for her child. But decades later, Eleanor couldn't stay silent anymore. She had tracked down Ruth's family, our family, and wanted to share the truth. My dad eventually came back into the room, his eyes red from crying. He sat down, picked up the letter, and read it silently. When he finished, he whispered, "I always knew something didn't add up." He told us that his mom, Ruth, had always been guarded about her past. She used to say she didn't have a birth certificate and that her parents found her at a church. My dad thought it was just an odd quirk of her upbringing, but now it all made sense. Over the next few weeks, my dad started digging into his mother's history. He contacted Eleanor, who was still alive and living in a small town a few states away. When he met her, he said it was like looking into a mirror. She had his eyes, his smile. She showed him old photos, shared stories of her life, and apologized over and over for what had happened to Ruth. But there was one more twist. Eleanor revealed that Ruth had an older brother, a boy who had also been sold to another family a few years earlier. My dad was stunned. He had an uncle out there somewhere, a man we'd never known existed. The discovery brought my dad closer to Eleanor, but it also stirred up a lot of pain. Ruth had passed away years earlier, and she had never known the full truth about her origins. My dad struggled with anger and grief, wondering why Eleanor hadn't fought harder to keep her children. But at the same time, he couldn't deny the connection he felt with her. In the end, the letter didn't just change the way we saw our family, it changed the way we understood ourselves. My dad found parts of his history he didn't even know were missing, and while the truth was painful, it also brought a strange sense of closure. That old letter now sits framed in my dad's study. It's a reminder of where we came from, of the secrets buried in our past, and of the courage it takes to uncover them. Story 8. The Locked Chest in the Attic. They say every family has skeletons in their closet, but we never expected ours to come crashing through the attic floor. It started with a storm, a ferocious, howling beast of wind and rain that battered our old family home. The roof had always been a little worse for wear, and that night something finally gave way. By the time the storm passed, water was dripping into the living room through a crack in the ceiling. "Looks like the attic's leaking again," my dad sighed as he grabbed a ladder. He was halfway up when he paused, looking down at me. "Come on, give me a hand." The attic wasn't a place we went often. It smelled of dust and old wood, and the floorboards creaked like they were whispering secrets. Most of the space was filled with forgotten furniture, musty boxes, and cobwebs that seemed older than the house itself. As we searched for the source of the leak, my flashlight beam landed on something unusual in the far corner, a small chest with a rusty padlock. It wasn't just the lock that caught my attention, it was the way the chest was tucked away, almost hidden under a pile of moth-eaten blankets and an old rocking chair. "Hey Dad," I called, pointing toward it. He looked over and frowned. "I don't remember seeing that before." We dragged the chest into the center of the attic. The padlock was old and brittle, and with a little effort we broke it open. The moment we lifted the lid, a strange smell hit us, earthy, metallic, almost like decay. Inside was a collection of items that didn't seem to belong together. An antique pocket watch, a faded photograph of a woman in a lace dress, a bundle of letters tied with twine, and a small leather-bound journal. The photograph caught my dad's attention first. He picked it up, squinting at the woman in the picture. This looks like my grandmother," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I reached for the journal. The leather cover was cracked, and the pages were yellowed with age. The handwriting inside was elegant but shaky, and as I started reading, a chill ran down my spine. The journal belonged to my great-grandfather, a man we knew only from family stories. He had died young, leaving behind his wife, my dad's grandmother, and their children. But the entries in the journal painted a very different picture of the man we thought we knew. One entry stood out. October 12, 1934. "She found out. I don't know how, but she knows. She says she's going to the police, but I can't let that happen. Not after everything I've done. I'll do whatever it takes to protect this family, even if it means burying the truth." The words were ominous, but they didn't make sense, not at first. My dad and I spent hours going through the letters in the chest, piecing together the story. It turned out that my great-grandfather wasn't just a farmer, as we'd always been told. He was involved in something much darker. The letters revealed that he had been part of a smuggling ring during Prohibition, moving illegal liquor across state lines. But it didn't stop there. One of the letters, written by his wife, accused him of killing a man who had threatened to expose the operation. The more we uncovered, the more horrifying the story became. My great-grandfather had kept his crimes a secret for years, but the guilt had eaten away at him. The journal entries grew increasingly erratic, filled with paranoia and fear. The final entry was just one sentence, scrawled across the page. "The chest will keep my sins hidden, but the weight of them will never leave me." For days my dad and I debated what to do. Should we tell the rest of the family? Should we take the letters to the authorities, even though everyone involved was long dead? In the end, we decided to share the story, but only with those who wanted to hear it. Some of our relatives refused to believe it, insisting that the man in the journal couldn't possibly be the same person who had raised their parents. Others were horrified but grateful to finally know the truth. The chest now sits in our attic once again, its contents untouched since the day we found them. It's a reminder of the shadows that can lurk in even the brightest family histories, and of the secrets that refuse to stay buried forever. Story 9, The Mirror That Reflected Too Much. It was supposed to be a harmless family heirloom, but every time we moved the mirror, something, or someone, stayed behind. The mirror had been in our family for generations. It was massive, the kind of piece that dominated a room, with an ornate silver frame carved into twisting vines and roses. My grandmother used to say it came from a manor in England, though no one knew how it ended up in our little Midwestern town. When Grandma passed, the mirror came to us. My mom wasn't exactly thrilled about it. It was heavy and took up way too much space, but she kept it in the hallway partly out of obligation and partly because it was admittedly beautiful. At first, it was just another piece of furniture. But then, little things started happening. It began with reflections. Every so often, I'd catch something out of the corner of my eye, just a flicker like someone passing by behind me. But when I turned around, no one was there. One night, as I was heading to bed, I stopped in front of the mirror to check my phone. The hallway was quiet and everyone else had already gone to sleep. As I looked into the glass, I noticed something odd. My reflection was delayed. I tilted my head to the left, and my reflection didn't move right away. It caught up a second later, almost like it had been distracted. I laughed it off, blaming it on being tired, and went to bed. But the next day my mom mentioned something strange. She said she'd heard footsteps in the hallway the night before but thought it was me. I told her I hadn't been up and she frowned. "It's probably just the house settling," she said, but her voice didn't sound convinced. The mirror became the center of all the little oddities in the house. My dad swore he heard whispers whenever he walked past it. My younger brother, who was only 6, said he didn't like the lady in the mirror. When we asked him to explain, he just shrugged and said, "She's always watching." One afternoon I decided to clean the mirror. I grabbed a cloth and some glass cleaner and started wiping it down. As I worked, I noticed something strange in the corner of the glass, a smudge that wouldn't go away no matter how hard I scrubbed. I leaned closer, trying to get a better look. That's when I realized it wasn't a smudge at all. It was a handprint. But it wasn't on the surface of the mirror, it was behind the glass. I froze, my heart racing. The handprint was small, like that of a child, and it was pressed against the inside of the glass as if someone was trying to get out. I told my mom about it, but she dismissed it, saying it was probably just a trick of the light. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A week later, things escalated. I was sitting in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a crash from the hallway. I ran to see what had happened and found the mirror lying face down on the floor. It hadn't shattered, which was strange considering its size and weight. But the strangest part was the deep scratch on the wall behind it, 4 long, jagged lines like claw marks. That was the final straw for my mom. She decided the mirror had to go. We loaded it into the truck and took it to a local antiques dealer. The man at the shop was in his 60s, with glasses perched on the edge of his nose. When he saw the mirror, he hesitated. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice low. "It's been in our family for years," my mom replied. The man nodded slowly, running his fingers along the frame. "This isn't just any mirror," he said. "It's what they call a scrying mirror. People used them in the old days to communicate with things they shouldn't." We left the mirror at the shop and drove home, hoping that was the end of it. But the house didn't feel the same. It was quieter, sure, but there was an emptiness to it, like a piece of it had been taken away. Then a few nights later I woke up to a noise. It was faint, like the sound of fingernails tapping on glass. I got up and followed the sound to the hallway, but the mirror was gone. Instead, I saw something in the reflection of the window at the end of the hall, a figure just barely visible, staring back at me. Story 10, the book that read you. It started with an innocent purchase from an old bookstore, but the book wasn't meant to be read, it was meant to trap whoever opened it. It was raining that afternoon when I stumbled into the old bookstore. The place smelled of damp paper and ancient wood, the kind of scent that wraps itself around you like a heavy blanket. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a way to kill time while the storm raged outside. The aisles were cramped, lined with towering shelves that seemed ready to collapse under the weight of too many stories. That's when I saw it. The book was sitting on a table at the back of the store, bound in cracked leather that looked older than the building itself. There was no title on the spine, no author's name on the cover. Just a strange symbol embossed into the leather, something that looked like a coiled serpent swallowing its own tail. Curiosity got the better of me. "Do you know anything about this one?" I asked the shopkeeper, an older man with a grizzled beard and a distracted air. He glanced at the book and frowned. "That's not for sale," he said quickly, his voice a little too sharp. "Why is it out then?" He didn't answer. Instead, he snatched the book off the table and shoved it under the counter. But by then it was too late. The symbol was burned into my mind and I couldn't stop thinking about it. The storm lasted all night and the next day I went back to the store. The shopkeeper wasn't there, just a younger guy who looked like he was covering someone's shift. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "I was here yesterday and saw a book with a serpent symbol on it. Do you still have it?" The guy frowned, then rummaged around under the counter. A moment later he pulled out the same book. "This one?" "Yeah," I said, my pulse quickening. He shrugged. $20. I handed over the cash and the book was mine. That night I sat down to read it. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with dense handwriting that didn't look printed so much as scratched into the paper. The text was written in a language I didn't recognize, but as I flipped through the pages, the words seemed to shift and rearrange themselves into English. The first line chilled me to the bone. "The reader of this book has already begun the process." I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just a gimmick, a clever way to draw the reader in. But as I read on, the words became more personal. They described things no one could know about me, my childhood fears, my biggest regrets, even the scar on my left hand from when I fell off my bike at age 7. I slammed the book shut, my heart racing. But when I tried to put it down, I couldn't. My hands wouldn't let go of it, as if the leather cover had fused to my skin. The lights flickered. A low hum filled the room, vibrating in my chest like the growl of some unseen beast. I tried to throw the book across the room, but my arms refused to move. Instead, the pages turned on their own, faster and faster, until they landed on a blank page near the back. And then, to my horror, words began to appear. "You can't stop now. You've been chosen." The room grew colder. Shadows gathered in the corners, stretching toward me like black tendrils. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The book began to write more. "You must finish the story, or the story will finish you." I don't remember how long I sat there, staring at the page. The only thing I know is that when I finally managed to put the book down, the sun was rising. I wanted to get rid of it, but every time I tried, it came back. I burned it once, watched the flames consume the leather and ash the pages, but when I walked into my bedroom that night, the book was sitting on my desk as pristine as ever. Now it's always there watching me. I've learned not to open it again, but sometimes I catch it whispering. I can't hear the words, but I feel them crawling under my skin, begging me to turn the pages. I don't know how this story ends, but I'm starting to think it's not my story at all. Make sure to like, share, and subscribe if you're enjoying the vibe. Your support helps us keep uncovering the stories you won't find anywhere else. And trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next, because the best, or the scariest, is yet to come.